Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Rocky Moore and Elvis, for having me. There's a reason why I'm the first speaker in the first panel of the day. I have nothing to say about policy, which makes me the odd man out in the room. But I do have data. And good data, I hope, makes for good policy, and I hope you find what I have to say useful. Now, I'm going to talk about racial and ethnic wealth gaps in the US. And my focus is going to be specifically on the wealth gaps among white, black, and Hispanic families. This list, unfortunately, excludes many, such as Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders or, did I say Native Americans or Asian Americans first? Well, so anyways, it is not an act of commission. It is really a consequence of a lack of adequate data that one can trace over time or measure change from time to time. Now, we all know that wealth is the value of assets you have accumulated, such as a house, less the debt you may have, such as the mortgage on that house. I will address three basic questions regarding wealth. How big is the racial and ethnic wealth gap? How has it trended over time? And what factors might explain the existence of the wealth gap? But first, let's begin with a very basic question. We can certainly agree that more wealth is better than less. We can also agree that along with income, consumption, and employment, it is one of the better or true indicators of our economic well-being. But what is it specifically about wealth that we care about? What does it get us? Well, it certainly gets us protection against the rainy days. You have a recession or you are unemployed, there's an earnings gap. Wealth helps us get by. It helps us out in the long run in the form of retirement income. It also provides for upward mobility for future generations. We can give them education, we can give them better education, we can give them access to better health care. We can do many things for our descendants. It also is an indicator of quality of life. It's something that gives us shelter. An owned home is the major asset for most of us. And as we are learning from research by others, wealth is also correlated with social and political influence, or otherwise it has something to do with equality of opportunity. Now, I'm going to show you two measures of the wealth gap. There will be two accounts to begin with, then I'll focus on one. We have two major data sources that allow us to measure wealth. One is from the Federal Reserve, their survey of consumer finances, and one is from the Census Bureau from the survey of income program and participation. They differ in many ways, they often lead to different results, but they do agree on one fundamental aspect. The wealth gap is present, it is large, and it is persistent. But there is some disagreement on what the recent trend may have been, so I thought I would show you both estimates. I begin with the survey of consumer finances. There's a lot going on in this slide. You may have familiarized yourself because it's been tweeted, I believe. But what you have here is the gap in wealth between whites and blacks on the left-hand side and between whites and Hispanics on the right-hand side. The median wealth of white families is at the top. It tends to hug the $100,000 line or lie above it. The median wealth of black and Hispanic families lies below, and it tends to hug the $10,000 line, sometimes a little higher, but recently trending down. And this has been true since 1983. That's when these data first began to measure household wealth. As of 2013, white families had $141,900 at the median. Black families had only $11,000, and Hispanics had 13,700. So if we take this ratio as a measure of the wealth gap, whites had 13 times the wealth of black families and 10 times the wealth of Hispanic families. These ratios large ratios have been around for a while, and they have in fact increased a little bit during the economic recovery. Now, here's the view from the other data source, the Survey of Income Program and Participation. Here I don't show you actual dollar amounts, not to confuse the picture too much, but you can see that since the 1980s, the story is very similar. Whites have consistently outstripped the wealth of Hispanic and black families by a ratio of 10 to 1. It shot up to as much as 20 to 1 during the recession. And more recently, maybe it's returning to historical norms. We don't know. The story is yet to be written, but it is still higher than it was before the recession. Now, so the wealth gaps are here. They are large. But these are gaps at the median. Take the black family in the middle of the black wealth distribution, take the white family in the middle of the white family distribution, and compare them. So, and that's what it looks like. How does it look like for poor black families compared to poor white families, or rich black families compared to rich white families? What are the differences if I go beyond the median? And some surprising numbers perhaps emerge. First of all, there's a large proportion of Hispanic and black families that have no wealth. Upwards of 1/3 at the moment, 34% for black families, 29% for Hispanic families. So a lot of them have no wealth whatsoever, or even perhaps they are in debt. So we'll set them aside for the moment. And let's take a look at the top half of the wealth distribution. These are people who lie in the 50th percentile and above within the wealth distribution of their racial or ethnic groups. So if I compare the wealth of Hispanic, this is black families compared to the wealth of white families, and both of them lie, say, from the 50th to 75th percentile of their wealth distribution, the wealth ratio is no longer 20 to 1, it is 8 to 1. And if I go further to the right, look at steadily more wealthy families within each group, the wealth ratio is only, relatively speaking, 2 or 3, and it has been that way for a while. The recession actually did not make any difference. So it's a very different picture that emerges if you look at the top half of the wealth distribution. The same happens if I look at Hispanic families. I go beyond the 75th percentile. I'm looking at the top 25% of families in each group. The ratios are in that order of 2 to 3. Between the 50th and 75th percentile, the ratio is no longer 14, it is 7. What about poor families? Here I can't even trace these ratios because they are not literally not defined. And why are they not defined? On the left, you see white families who are the poorest. They lie in the bottom 25th of the wealth distribution. They had about $550 in wealth before the recession, which came down to 0 after the recession. Well, look at what happened to the poorest Hispanic and black families. They were in debt to begin with, but not enormous amounts of debt, about $1,000. After the recession, their debt levels had climbed into more than the $10,000 range. If you go to people who are a little bit better off, the 25th to 50th wealth percentile, in 2010, this is where the real dramatic picture emerges. White families who are in the 25th to 50th percentile, their wealth level is about $50,000. For Hispanics, it is $1,000. That's a ratio of 50 to 1. For black families, it's only $120. I think that's a ratio of about 400 something to 1. So enormous gaps towards the bottom and the middle, approaching the middle of the wealth distribution. I think I'm down to about a minute, so I'll very quickly summarize. We can get into more in the Q&A. Why do these wealth gaps exist, and perhaps why are they so persistent? There are several factors that are associated with wealth, and on each one of these factors, Black and Hispanic families, their outcomes appear not as well off as the outcomes for white families. One is home ownership. Home ownership among whites is about 30 percentage points higher than among Hispanics and Blacks. Little things like financial sector participation. Do you have a checking account? Do you have a money market account? Do you have a 401k? Do you participate in your pension plan at work? Again, minority outcomes are not at the level for white households. And we have divides in income and education and other things that may be somewhat surprising, demographic factors for Hispanics. At the median, the typical Hispanic householder is 10 years younger than the white householder. And 10 years buys you a lot of time to accumulate wealth. They're also much more likely to be immigrant and unauthorized, factors that contribute to differences in economic outcomes. That's specific to Hispanics. So I will conclude at this time. Thank you very much.